Democrats are waiting for a leader as opposed to all of us as leaders rising up. How do we stop our own self fuckery?
Well, a large part of the problem is that, and boy, did you identify it well, is that the right wing machine helps people with great wealth. I mean, it's all you've got most billionaires in America paying less than 3% income taxes. That's the result of the right wing machine. So therefore, you had 150 billionaire families who were the major donors to Republican causes in the last election. You had 3 billionaire families on the left, who were making large donations. Because for a billionaire, first of all, to become a billionaire, you generally have to be fairly well animated by greed. And
Mm.
and for a billionaire, putting money into politics is just a wise investment.
This is Black Man Spy.
Hi, I'm Malcolm Nance, and welcome to Black Man Spy. This week's episode is going to be exciting because we have the number one progressive talk show host in America on this episode. Now, even though he is the progressive talk show host, this show is favored by everyone who loves democracy, believes in the American experiment. And that clearly does not mean people who are in MAGA, but all the rest of us, the 78 million people that didn't vote for Donald Trump, and most likely the 80 million people who didn't vote at all, believe in what America stands for. And there's no better person that I can think of right now to give us some sage advice. I know that a lot of people have been down on age, but sometimes you need to meet and listen to people who truly have a long, deep depth of knowledge of what America is and what America stands for and where America is going now that we are well into our knees, up to our knees in authoritarian fascist dictatorship. That is the Trump regime. And a person who is well known for this is Thom Hartmann. Thom Hartmann is an author, businessman, radio broadcaster forever, progressive political commentator who has 7 million listeners to his program, The Thom Hartmann Show. What I like about his show is he has all these people who are writing progressive ballads, bluegrass country songs, and rap songs about the situation we're going through today. And I jokingly said one time, how come we're not hearing any music like, Arlo Guthrie and Bob Dylan and Joan Baez in this era of resistance to government? And it's there. It's played on his show. He has it on TuneIn. He has it on Twitter. He has it on Apple Music. It's amazing. But if you listen to the Thom Hartmann program, you will hear it between every commercial break. And some of that music is absolutely amazing. He is also author of the latest of his, I don't know, 35, 40 books. He's going to show us his bookcase later. The Last American President, which he wrote about the dire situation that we're in, which was published just 3 months ago and has barely scratched the surface of the crisis. With that, let's listen to this interview with Thom Hartmann, and I'll meet you on the other side. Thom Hartmann, welcome to Black Man Spy, the podcast for people that don't listen to you every day at 12 o'clock, which means they're going to hear this once, but after this, I hope that everyone will be listening to Thom Hartmann. This is where I get a lot of my information because, like many people, I don't watch cable news anymore after the election and all the sucking up that the news media has been doing to the current regime. So welcome and thank you for coming.
Well, thank you, Malcolm. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you. I appreciate the invitation.
It is absolutely my pleasure. Well, first, before we go into the disaster that is the what shreds remain of the American experiment, I understand you have a relatively new book.
Yeah, it's The Last American President is the title, And it's basically, it starts out with how Trump got psychologically destroyed by the environment he grew up in, and turned into this essentially psychopath or sociopath, and hooked up with Roy Cohn, who was really a psychopath and who taught him his tricks, and then how he's using those tricks to basically end democracy in America and what we can do about it. That's a summary of the book.
Well, one thing that I've noticed, because I do a podcast once a week, or a Substack stream with Michael Cohen and Lev Parnas, right? Which we call Unleash, but I call Two Felons and a Spy. And but these are people who sat and worked with him on a day-to-day basis, particularly Michael Cohen. And one of the things that they say is that he uses the same methodologies over and over and over again because they're successful for him. And he's managed to expand it to a national scale. But like you said, this was the things that were hammered into his head by Roy Cohen. And, always, whatever the truth is what you say it is. Never back down if caught in a lie, right? And never, ever, ever surrender in the face of your enemy, or in any circumstance, admit fault ever. And this strikes me as psychopathy. I mean, I haven't had Mary Trump on, but she talks about this extensively. And as you know, George Conway last year, with a group of people, of psychiatrists who had written a book called Unfit, which also was made into a movie about Donald Trump, what we're watching is a mental health crisis unfold in a man who has 4,500 atomic bombs. Would you agree to that?
Absolutely. In fact, it's one of the main premises of my new book. And it's an extraordinarily dangerous moment for America. And by the way, I would add, and I know you know this, Malcolm, this is not a unique circumstance. Hitler was a psychopath. Mussolini was a psychopath. Stalin was a psychopath. Pol Pot was a psychopath. Orban is a psychopath, or at least a sociopath. Pinochet was a psychopath. People who actually not just live in a delusional state, not just are willing to impose their delusion on others, not just becoming successful cult leaders, but also people that would just be kind of the sociopaths. These are also people who delight in causing other people pain. They draw power. They draw, an internal psychic power from other people's pain and agony. Thus, he can go down to Alligator Auschwitz and look around and go, ha, 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 oh boy, and just delight himself at sticking Abrego Garcia in a prison in El Salvador, or the gay makeup artist from Los Angeles. I mean, it's just this is extraordinarily dangerous for any democracy. And particularly for the United States.
I'm glad you brought that point up, because between the two felons that I consult over how Donald Trump thinks, one believes that what we see on the face, that in fact Donald Trump doesn't delight in the pain of others. He just doesn't give two fucks about the pain of others. What he delights in is the ritualistic humiliations that he's able to extract from them, like Marco Rubio, right? Head of the reason they chose Rubio as Secretary of State in terms of the way that Donald Trump sees this ritualistic humiliation that he needs to break people who have contradicted him in the past, drag them through the mud, and make them show fealty to him on an international scale, right? To literally give up everything you have ever believed to satisfy the narcissism of Donald Trump. I mean, if Rubio's just one example. I mean,
those
the Mitt Romney
dinner. Those are his friends. I would argue that he delights in the pain of his enemies. So I think both.
Okay, that I really buy, because we're the enemies, right?
Yeah.
And but my real problem with all of this, because of course this is a national security forum that we're generally talking in here, I'm seeing enormous signs of mental decline, mental illness. Why we're talking about his basic mental illness. The man is a sociopath or a psychopath, as George Conway in The Psychopath put it. But in fact, this guy's mental decline is way far exceeds anything Joe Biden ever had, and the media gives this a 100% pass. How do you explain that?
Well, I think it's entirely possible that he's always been this way. That what we're seeing isn't really dementia. It's obviously there's a little bit of age-related cognitive decline there that you would expect. 79-year-old, mixing people's names up and dates and things like that.
Sure.
But I think he has always been, Dunning-Kruger syndrome off the scale. People who believe that they're experts when they have no expertise at all. He's always exhibited that dark triad of behaviors. I'm not convinced that he's actually in a major state of decline. Not just having been a psychotherapist once, but I watched my own mother go through Alzheimer's and die of it, and I just think he's always been this way, frankly. And he's obviously, you compare his speeches now to his speeches a decade ago, or his interviews and things. He's nowhere near as sharp as he was, but he's also 79 years old. I'm not certain that if they're going to do a 25th Amendment, if that's the goal of this kind of armchair psychoanalysis, I don't think they're going to find enough evidence for that. It's got to be his malice and his criminality and his destruction of democracy, rather than his lack of cognitive function.
Well, I mean, he essentially operates a Politburo, right?
Yeah.
The Soviet rubber stamp that was the communist elite that we now call his cabinet and the leadership of the Republican Party. So I don't think 25th Amendment is ever going to be on the table. They'll pull a full Nancy Reagan here, right? They'll allow him to sit in the office and dribble before they'll ever do that.
I thought it was interesting that JD was calling for all of the files to be released,
right?
The Epstein files. That's got to be the last thing Trump wants.
Yeah, but I believe that there's a scripted White House here, right? This is literally Donald Trump's reality show, and he enjoys. This is The Apprentice, international events version of Apprentice. And I think that JD Vance doesn't open his mouth without them having had the 9 a.m. meeting and them telling JD what he will say that day. Because JD's the foil, right? Like that whole, in case you guys wonder why I pulled that word out. I got that from Bullwinkle when I was a kid. When they said, Boris, we need foils. And he says, moose and squirrel? Moose and squirrel. That is what. I'm sorry. I knew you would appreciate that old Cold War kickback, but this is Black Man Spy. JD Vance is foils. Okay, when they need someone to come out and play the fool or to ameliorate or mollify their base, I think that's where it happens. And I don't think anything that comes out of it. You and I both know as adults, this is just the worst administration in the history of the United States. The Trump administration's organization really strikes me like the governor's office of Governor Latomaine in Blazing Saddles, right? Mel Brooks. Mel Brooks with the ping pong paddles for everybody, right? And the secretary with the big boobs, However, Governor Latomaine's office is more organized. He understood, right, the significance of Bart being black, and he understood the significance, the consequences of what would happen if they put him in that position, and carried out, signed, the authorization to become a sheriff. I don't see any of that organization in the Trump administration. I see individuals who are lined up who are taking advantage of the fact that they can loot.
Yeah.
What do you think?
No, I agree, and this is something that always accompanies autocracy. Every autocracy in the world, LCC in Egypt is suddenly a billionaire. Orban is suddenly a multi-hundred millionaire. Putin is suddenly a billionaire. You don't find an autocrat. When I was doing international relief work back in the 80s and working in third world countries all over the world, I was in a lot of countries that were run by these kind of autocrats, and every single one of them, you had the elite and the autocrat himself, basically looting the country. And that's what Trump is doing right now. And you look at, I was just reading this morning a piece from David Sirota's, The Lever, I think it was Lever News, about how Jeff Yaz, the billionaire, who is the biggest American investor in TikTok. TikTok was supposed to be sold. It's a law.
Right.
But Yaz gives Trump $15 million for his, personal little leadership pack. And I believe with leadership packs, you can keep money after you leave office. And suddenly Trump delays, the forced sale of TikTok. It's like everything is for sale. It's organized looting. It's organized crime. And you know this, Malcolm. You've worked in these countries too. And so that's what I'm seeing. He's turned America into a third world country.
Well, we certainly have the attitude of it. I mean, I go to Canada almost every week. I'm pretty close to Canada, and I see a completely different country when I go there. Their version of their version of a very light socialist democracy is run with 40 million people. I mean, there are 2 million less Canadians in this world than there are African Americans, right? There are more African Americans than Canadians. But what I see up there is I see a higher level of industry. I see a higher level of buy-in. Not just, people complain about the Quebecois government and all that. But what I see is I see a more unified nation now than I've ever seen it before. I crossed the border back at, the Champlain border crossing, and I see only a few cars going south on a Friday afternoon, as there used to be hundreds. And then I cross and I feel the oppression now in the United States. Going through Nexus is an adventure to see whether I'm on the hit list. Do I have to neutralize my phones? I mean, to me, I'm from Philadelphia, so the American experiment is very personal to me, very personal. But now that we have this fire sale of a government, we have what Don thinks is a mafia Don in there. We all know is what I call a constitutional dictator, right? The Constitution will apply to some people, but not to everyone, right? What are the counteractions that we can do to come face to face with this?
Well, Erica Chenoweth, the statistician, learned, or political scientist, popularized this notion that when 3.5% of the population gets in the streets, things change. That may or may not be our salvation, but it's certainly a goal worth shooting for. I think our last big demonstration got to around 2%.
Right.
The striking thing to me, and I've written about this a couple times, is that if just 5 or 6 Republicans in the House and 3 or 4 Republicans in the Senate were to simply decide that the fate and future of American democracy is more important than their own political future, and start taking positions that reflected some integrity. And for a minute there, I thought Thom Tillis was going to do that. I mean, he went so far. But now he's back. He's probably looking at a future $1 million a year lobbying job or something. So he's got to toe the line. I don't know, but if we could just get a small handful of Republicans to do to the GOP what the Republicans convinced Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin to do to us when we were trying to pass the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, we could put a stop to this. We don't need to wait for the next election. And so I've been encouraging my listeners. I mean, we're on Sirius XM and on radio stations all over the country. We got a lot of listeners in red states. I'm encouraging them to constantly reach out to your Republican elected representatives and tell them, now's the time to leave the party, or now's the time to defy the party, or at least defy the president, and go back to become an Eisenhower or even a Romney Republican instead of one of these jobs.
Yeah, I had this discussion with Jim Acosta, Joe Walsh, and Michael Cohen.
Yeah.
And I said, all we require, or Hakeem Jeffries, his full-time job, since we don't see him doing very much other thing, other than making statements from the cooling saucer of democracy, right? His full-time job should be trying to get four of them to flip, promise them anything, chairmanships. Now's the time to game like Lincoln, right? Postmaster General, whatever you want to do, right? Get those four to flip. And I thought we had identified those four. Don Bacon, Fitzgerald from Pennsylvania. These were two heavies over Ukraine. As you know, I served in the Ukrainian army. So for me, that was very important. These guys were ride or die Ukrainian guys. And then once Trump made his reversal on Ukraine, they went and voted for the big, beautiful bill. Every damn one of the Republicans we thought that were malleable in some way, or were true patriots in some way. Lisa Murkowski, I never pay attention to Susan Collins, right? We know she's always going to lie, she's always going to flip. But none of these people seem that they are willing to keep, to really live up to their oaths. It's almost Ayn Randian in the way that, the way she described in The Fountainhead, the nepotism and the favoritism of the government. Holy cow, it's the Republican Party, and none of them seem loyal to the Constitution or to the flag, and they don't give two fucks about an oath. An oath is something they have to do to get an office in Capitol Hill. And to allow the money machine to start churning it out. And there's no different. I mean, I'm going to be honest. Are any of these people ever going to be Oscar Schindler? Are we going to get to the point where we need an Oscar Schindler?
Well, I think many would argue, particularly Hispanics, that were and many Black people as well, and increasingly women, even white women, that were there.
Right.
But particularly, the circumstances around ICE, that definitely were there, and it's a wild time, Malcolm. I mean, we are now in the midst of an authoritarian breakthrough of the destruction of our democracy.
I still think that we're branching into baby autocracy here. As I call it, I wrote in my book that the plot to destroy democracy, that Trump is a fundamental component of Putin's plan to have an axis of autocrats around the world, where now oligarchy, broligarchy, and money does all the talking. And, I jokingly wrote that book that, someday that Putin would do something to prove my point. And within days after it was published, he came out and said, liberal democracy is finished, right? In essence, oligarchy, money, fascism, right? Which Mussolini called the dictatorship of the corporate right, is the way that the world is today. And my problem is I fought against warlords and dictatorships like this. And it usually takes an enormous amount of 2,000-pound laser guided bombs to resolve this issue. But I'm a big believer, too, in the 3.5% protest movement, in the nonviolent protest movement. We had 76 million people vote for Kamala Harris. 2 million didn't vote for Trump. How do we get, if we had a third of the Kamala Harris voters, we would have broken the 4%. Sustained, by the way, the Harvard study said sustained protests, like they do in Belgrade, like they're doing in Budapest. What is it with us? Death doesn't seem to motivate Americans. Are we that broken? Is it going to take something nationally catastrophic beyond 9/11 levels for the American public to wake up to these threats?
Well, that's kind of the fourth turning hypothesis, is
Oh,
that
Jesus.
every 80 years we have an economic crisis followed by a war, followed by a progressive reboot. And, starting with the 1871 crash leading to the Civil War, or the Revolutionary War, the 1857 panic leading to the Civil War, the
Mm,
Republican Great Depression leading to World War II. I could argue for or against, Strauss and Howe's literal interpretation of all those details. But
mhm.
one of the big lessons that history does tell us is that Americans, and I think it's human nature, frankly, only respond in a really, really genuinely big way to a really, really genuinely big crisis. And I think with our media capture and Trump's intimidation of the media, ABC and CBS having already rolled over, he's disempowering Corporation for Public Broadcasting. He's locked Associated Press out of his White House briefings. The press is dialing back. The New York Times is regularly sane-washing him. The Washington Post and the LA Times are now owned by billionaires who've decided that going right wing is much better for them.
Mhm.
We've got this massive media consolidation that brought us 1,500 right-wing radio stations as a result of Bill Clinton signing the Telecommunications Act in 1996. You've got the end of the Fairness Doctrine and Reagan fast-tracking Rupert Murdoch's citizenship so that he could, develop Fox News. There's this media ecosystem in the United States that it is now possible to live in a right-wing bubble and literally never leave it. And I get these guys on my radio program to debate them. Sometimes, formally, and sometimes it's just callers.
Mhm.
And they literally live in a different world than the real world. They believe things that don't exist, and
Right.
the few things that do exist, they believe them in a context that is bizarre. And then on top of that, you've got the two biggest social media sites in the United States, X and Facebook, also run by right-wing billionaires who have tweaked their algorithms. And apparently Google has done this with YouTube as well to promote right-wing content and downgrade progressive content. I mean, I remember back
Right.
9 years ago when alternet.org was the
Yeah, I remember Alternate.
progressive website. And then
And
Google changed their algorithm so they no longer spidered it, so it no longer showed up in search results. And within 7 months, they were bankrupt and they had to sell themselves. And now it's
right.
owned by an individual guy who's a good guy, Michael. It runs the company well, but it's no longer a nonprofit and it's no longer the
Right.
big site that it used to be because Google changed their algorithm to the right, to promote right-wing sites and demote left-wing sites, apparently.
Right.
And
Trust me.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, trust me, I'm a victim of that. I lost 100. I had 1.1 million followers on election day. I lost 100,000 followers the day after election day because they were bots.
Yeah.
They were a completely false echo chamber atmosphere that was designed to attack me. And, tweets that used to get 40, 50,000 likes, almost a million views, now get a few hundred. And I mean, throttling is not a joke. But you've brought us, speaking of Alternet, you've brought me to a point that, that I'd like to discuss last here. For a moment of self-reflection as people who are liberals, conservatives, never Trumpers, right? Um, we don't operate the way that they do. I debated Ben Shapiro on Real Time with Bill Maher, and people were like, "Oh my God, I didn't really know who you were, other than what you did on MSNBC." And I said, "That's because Sheldon Adelson didn't hand me $10 million and tell me to go create a web paper and a blog, then hand me 50 million more later." This does not, funding liberal causes, funding democratic causes does not exist
Yeah.
amongst progressives.
Yeah.
I don't know a liberal millionaire. I know people who have made over $1 million, but we do not have a system where they are funding their ideology, which of course is the corporate right Mussolini talked about, right? But we don't even have individuals that care enough to do that. There used to be Networks Nation. Networks Nation was an enormous progressive platform in the 1990s. in the early 2000s. Now, I stumble upon that they still run it, and they still run a few things, but it's not CPAC. It's not Turning Point USA. These people are literally running a global network, right? Steve Bannon's Gladiator School is global. I was in Greenland just recently, investigating Trump's, nefarious little antics up there. And the one guy that they're calling the Trump of Greenland wasn't there for me to interview because he was in Hungary on election day, brought there by Eric Trump Jr. And they were funding him to speak at this right wing conglomeration. And we don't have this, right? We don't have a globally funded, constant Nuremberg rally the way that the right wing does. We have a hard time organizing. We just did No Kings, and Indivisible stood up for that. No offense to Eric Levin, but they tend to collapse right after a major campaign, whereas we need to be out every weekend. And Democrats, as Tara Setmeyer just said on my show last week, and Joy Reid, are waiting for a leader as opposed to all of us as leaders rising up. How do we stop our own self-fuckery?
Well, a large part of the problem is that, and boy, did you identify it well. A large part of the problem is that the right-wing machine helps people with great wealth. I mean, it's all you've got most billionaires in America paying less than 3% income taxes. That's the result of the right-wing machine. So therefore, you had 150 billionaire families who were the major donors to Republican causes in the last election. You had 3 billionaire families on the left, who were making large donations. Because for a billionaire, first of all, to become a billionaire, you generally have to be fairly well animated by greed. And for a billionaire, putting money into politics is just a wise investment. I mean, it's a very inexpensive investment, frankly, as Elon Musk found out. Look at how his companies are still getting more government contracts. And they figured this out back in the 80s about media, that they just needed to build out this media infrastructure. I have an acquaintance, sort of a friend, who's a right-wing talk show host. He's not one of the top tier. He's on maybe 200 stations, but he's somebody who probably most people wouldn't recognize his name unless they were conservatives. And we were traveling together once. We went to South Sudan and to Darfur together. And he was telling me the story. I was like, we just started talking about salaries and, income and, what was going on. I said, how much do you make? And he says, I make about $70,000 a year. He's got he's got a lot of radio stations and a fairly huge show. I'm like, wow, that's not a lot of money for what you're doing. And he's like, no, here's how it works. He says, 20, 30 times a year, I'll go speak in a high school auditorium to 200 kids. And every time I do, I get a $20,000 check from this foundation.
Yeah, he's on the speaker circuit.
And it's not even, it's just a phony thing. And this is available apparently to every right-wing host in America. So, you can make $1 million a year in speaking fees, even though the network is only paying you 60 or 70 grand a year. I mean, it's just, there is this, Politico, this was 4 or 5 years ago, outed the fact that Rush Limbaugh was getting $2 million a year from Heritage, and Sean Hannity was getting $1 million a year from Heritage. I mean, they've got this very, very well-funded machine that just pours money into right-wing media and has for years and years and years. And when Russia got busted for giving $100,000 a segment to these right-wing podcasters, everybody thought, oh my God, it's an anomaly. No, they were simply doing what the right-wing billionaires have been doing all along.
Yeah,
I helped start Air America Radio. I wrote the original business plan for it, and
I remember
start the thing. And, back in 2003, 2004, and we didn't have enough money to buy radio stations. So we leased stations, 54 stations from Clear Channel. And so in 2008, when Barack Obama wins the presidency, in 2009, Mitt Romney decides that the next cycle around, he's going to run against Obama and he wants to become president. So he has his company buy Clear Channel. And within a year or within a year and a half, every single one of the stations that we were on flips to sports format, claiming that they were.
Right.
And I know they weren't losing money. I was operating out of one right here in Portland. I mean, we were using their studios. The management was close friends of mine. But he killed Air America because they just took us off the air. They just deplatformed us. These guys are very methodical and very powerful, and they've got a hell of a lot of money, and they've largely cowed the national media in the United States. And I think that accounts for this phenomena that you're describing here, Malcolm. And I don't have an easy answer for it other than the structural stuff that is so important, which is reversing Citizens United and basically reinstating something like the Voting Rights Act. I think it's absolutely insane that if Georgia wants to take away your gun, they have to go to a court and prove that you shouldn't have a gun. But if Georgia wants to take away your vote, they don't even have to tell you. They just do it. And in other words, our right to a gun, our Second Amendment right, is greater than our right to vote, even though the 1993, I think it is, National Voting Rights Act, the motor voter law, explicitly says, both in the preamble and in the black letter of the law, voting is a right in the United States. It says that. The phrase right to vote appears in the Constitution as well. But the Supreme Court has never ratified it. In fact, if anything, in Shelby County, they knocked it down. And, we've got to get back to the point where voting is a right and money is no longer the biggest influence in politics. Those two things are the cancer at the core of our system that have brought us Trump, that have brought us to this point. And it's going to take a hell of a challenge. And like we said earlier, I suspect that we're on the edge of a major economic disaster here in the United States. I think that may well be the wake-up call, just like it was in 1932.
Well, that's happy.
Well, it's better than a civil war.
Every once in a while, I try very hard to make a joke during this show, and that is as good as I'm going to get there. And I want to thank you for coming and explaining this today. And I think you've given us some points here that for listeners who can't cut away and listen to you for 2-3 hours a day on Sirius XM, or like I do, I cheat. I go to TuneIn. I listen to WCPT 820 out of Chicago, so I get it for free. But thank you again for coming, and I appreciate you broadcasting from Powell's Bookstore. Actually, that's just your house.
Yeah.
Massive. For those of you who are listening on TuneIn, on Apple, he has an enormous library behind him.
Yeah.
I used to think that I had a big library. Now I want to know who installed his bookcases, but it does look
all the
like
books on these shelves right here. This half of the shelves right here.
he's pointing to the left side. You wrote those?
Yes.
I was joking about 30 books.
Yeah, no, from here to here, from here to here. They're all books that I wrote. A lot of them are fine editions, and one's hardback and one's paperback and all that kind of stuff. But yeah.
Holy cow. You can tell everything about a man or a woman by the way their library is presented in their home. And I'm trying to install one right now, but the ICE has arrested all of the carpenters here in upstate New York. Not joking.
Yeah.
And I will have to hand build a bookstore, a bookcases, 13 different bookcases just to manage to start. But your house really does look like the lovely Powell's Books in Portland, and that you have written. I don't even want to count. I'm going 10 per shelf, 30, 40 books. I don't know. And various editions tells us that you are truly one of the sages of leadership that we need to consult all the time. Or as the Republicans call you, a bunch of dirty old hippies who want to bring communism to America. So, thanks for coming in and giving me the opportunity to have that one joke during this show. So thank you so much, and I'll come on your show anytime.
I look forward to it, Malcolm, and thanks so much for inviting me. It's great to see you again.
Okay, good to see you. Take care. Well, I managed to get one joke in during this rather otherwise somber interview. Sobering. is a better way to put that, because even though we were both having this conversation about the decline of the United States and this cracking of the American experiment, I think it's great to understand that Thom Hartmann has been at this for decades, decades. And if he believes that we can get out of it, that we can use people power to reach that 3.5% threshold, then I'm out to fight for that, and to make sure that we always have the sage counsel of graybeards. Well, I have a gray beard, but graybeard like Thom Hartmann, who his bookcase alone is a significant sign of the depth of knowledge of this man, and we should all pay attention to him. Please subscribe to him on Thom Hartmann program. Listen to the Thom Hartmann program on progressive radio stations, Sirius XM, on Apple, on Stitcher, and all other places that find podcasts are heard. He is worth listening to all the time. With that, thank you for coming to another exciting adventure of Black Man Spy. You can also hear me on Apple, Stitcher. You can find me on Twitter, or X as they call it, at Malcolm Nance, Blue Sky, malcolmnance.bsky.social, YouTube, at the Black Man Spy podcast on YouTube, and most notably where I do most of my work, which is on Substack. That's where I do all of my written work and many of our short videos. That's malcolmnance.substack.com. Please become a paid subscriber there. I do this for you, but you are sustaining me in this fight against dictatorship and autocracy. And I thank you for subscribing, or even just listening to this, because I need to vent and you are my venti. So, as I say, next week, I will see you again on the beach.